Before attempting a takeoff, pilots will need to calculate how much runway will be needed, and how much distance will be required to climb above any obstacles. Other factors, such as how fast the aircraft can climb to cruising altitude and how much runway will be needed for landing, are also very important. Pilots will need to make these performance calculations ahead of time so they don't end up with a close call like the guy in the following video.
Hello.
Two important airspeeds that pilots will need to become familiar with for their aircraft are the best angle of climb airspeed, VX, and the best rate of climb airspeed, VY. These speeds can be found in the airplane flight manual. Sometimes, it will be important to gain the greatest amount of altitude in the shortest distance, such as when you need to clear a tree or building at the end of the runway. To achieve this, the pilot should fly at the best angle of climb speed, or VX. On other occasions, the pilot will simply want to climb to cruising altitude in the shortest amount of time and should fly the aircraft at the best rate of climb airspeed. A very important factor that pilots will need to consider when flying in warmer weather or at higher elevation airports is density altitude. The following video shows what can happen to the aircraft's performance when attempting to take off from an airport in the mountains.
On August 4th, 2012, this video made it to the internet. What you're about to witness is a plane crash, as it was experienced from the right seat inside the cockpit. The accident took place on Saturday, June 30th, 2012. At the time of this report, information was preliminary and subject to change, but some had been collected by the NTSB. The aircraft is a Stinson Model 108-3, generally a 165 horsepower single-engine high-wing propeller-driven aircraft capable of carrying 4, plus full fuel and light baggage. But an aircraft's performance is dependent, among other things, on the density of the air it moves through. And the aircraft appears to be operating from Bruce Meadows Airstrip, a 5,000-foot-long dirt and grass airstrip situated at an elevation of 6,370 feet, surrounded by 8,000 and 9,000-foot mountain peaks near the town of Stanley, Idaho. And that may be important. Watch what happens here. What you just saw was the aircraft skipping off the ground after having previously become airborne, only after prolonged ground run. The aircraft seems unwilling to climb. We'll not speculate as to the cause of the crash, but it may nonetheless provide a good example of what pilots call a high-density altitude takeoff. Cold, low-altitude air is more dense. It's thicker than air found at higher altitudes and/or higher temperatures. Moisture in the air, humidity, displaces air molecules and also acts to thin the air. For the pilot of a propeller-driven aircraft, thick air has its benefits. It gives the surfaces of the aircraft, the wings and propeller, more to push against, as it were. It gives a naturally aspirated, non-turbocharged engine more air molecules to mix with fuel, and that results in higher power output. Relevant to what you're seeing here, the NTSB has collected air data, including barometric pressure, temperature, and moisture for the accident's location on the day of the crash. The figures show that while the aircraft was physically located at an elevation of 6,370 feet, the air around it was as thin as that found at 9,167 feet on a standard day. In other words, compared with a cooler day at a lower altitude, the engine of this aircraft had less air to mix with fuel. It put out less power, while the propeller moved less air and produced less thrust. Meanwhile, the wings produced less lift for any given speed over the ground. In practice, that means the aircraft needed more land to get to speed and more speed to create lift, all the while working with less available power. It means it was harder for the aircraft to start to fly. Assuming that the pilot was attempting to climb, this particular aircraft appears strained at best and unwilling at worst. Whatever the cause, this was the result. All 4 men involved in this accident walked away. Early reports state that the pilot suffered the worst injury, including a broken jaw. Shown in slow motion, you can get a sense of how the airframe absorbed energy. Each impact with a tree lessens the amount of energy left for the final impact with the ground. The occupants were lucky. Once over the trees, there was very little the pilot could do. If faced with low airspeed and rising terrain, a turn was out of the question. At that point, riding it in might have been their best and only option. I'm Glenn Pugh for avweb.com. Thanks for watching.
The following video, produced by the AOPA Air Safety Institute, explains density altitude and why it is important for pilots. After watching the video, take some time to work through the FAA written exam questions on aircraft performance.
Density altitude. What causes it, and how does it affect your airplane? Let's jump right in. Heat, humidity, and altitude all lower the air density, and therefore increase density altitude. Heat causes air molecules to have a lot of energy and move farther apart. Water molecules, as in humidity, displace air molecules, and lower atmospheric pressure found at altitude causes air molecules to spread farther apart. All of this has a major impact on how your aircraft performs as the wings, engine, and propeller struggle to grip the thinner air. Dealing with high-density altitude is commonplace for pilots who often fly in hot weather, high humidity, or higher elevations, but for many of us, it can be easily overlooked with profound implications. So pay attention to density altitude, whether reported during flight planning via the ATIS or by ATC, and use your POH and an E6B to calculate density altitude and aircraft performance. Now, what can you do about it? Here are a few tips. Fly light to avoid max gross weight and high-density altitude ramifications when dealing with an airplane already performing differently than you're used to. Determine proper fuel-air mixture. If your checklist suggests full rich mixture at sea level, don't assume the same setting at higher density altitudes. Engines differ, so refer to your airplane's POH or the engine's digital monitor or fuel flow gauge manual for optimum power. For a quick and easy method, advance the throttle to take off power during ground run-up and begin reducing or leaning the mixture until the RPM increases and peaks. That's your optimum setting. If you lean beyond this point, the RPM begins to decrease, and eventually the engine will sputter as it is starved for fuel. Similarly, before joining the traffic pattern, determine the best mixture for optimum power during landing or go-around by applying full power, then leaning until RPM peaks. Fly indicated airspeeds. If rotation speed is 55 knots, don't try to rotate at 40 just because you're eating up more runway than usual. Likewise on landing, the ground and near objects will pass by more quickly. That's correct. Your ground speed is faster for the equivalent airspeed at higher density altitudes when the airplane needs more space to get the required air molecules to fly. Use long runways, but remember the abort point rule. Reach at least 70% of your rotation speed at the runway's midpoint, or abort. For example, a Cessna 172 with a rotation speed of 55 knots departs a 3,000-foot runway. If the airplane's not at 38 knots by 1,500 feet, abort. Watch airspeed and trends and maneuver carefully on climb-out and during cruise, as your airplane isn't going to accelerate rapidly, nor climb effectively. On takeoff, get airborne, and then lower the pitch angle to accelerate in ground effect for the remaining available runway. As you approach the runway end, begin a gradual climb in pitch to climb speed. Chair fly this a few times so you're comfortable with the procedure. Be aware that pitch or bank changes will result in a quicker deceleration than at sea level as airspeed bleeds off faster at higher density altitudes. Aircraft response to flap retraction, especially early flap retraction, will be more exaggerated than at lower density altitudes. Since the engine is less powerful, you can't regain speed and lift quickly, so monitor POH speeds and positive climb indications carefully. For the same reasons, be extremely attentive to flying into canyons and close to mountains or obstacles, and do not rely on visual cues you'd normally depend on to clear terrain, because your climb path at higher density altitude is much shallower than expected. Fly early in the day when temperatures are cooler, so performance will be better. We're all well aware that aviation is terribly unforgiving of carelessness or neglect, so let's pay attention to density altitude and its effect on airframe, engine, and propeller performance. Think through your density altitude procedures, and never just hope you'll be fine.